requested a simple reward. They handed me an alien vampire instead. The ceremony had already gone sideways before I opened my mouth. I could feel it in the way the alien dignitaries were looking at me. 300 beings from 47 civilizations packed into the Grand Conclave Hall on Yelthari Station, all of them regarding me with the specific kind of reverence that people reserve for things they consider almost too significant to be real. The Keth ambassador had actual fluid running down the sides of its face. The mall delegation was humming in unison, low and resonant, a sound that my translation chip told me carried the meaning of deepest acknowledgement. A group near the far wall, species I had never encountered, and whose name I still cannot pronounce, had lowered their foreheads to the polished floor. All of this for me. Sergeant Dara Cole, 14th Human Expeditionary Brigade, who had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 2 weeks, who was still wearing her second-best uniform because her best one had been ventilated by shrapnel during the Battle of Yelthari, and who smelled, no matter how she felt about it, like scorched hull plating and recycled air. The Grand Conclave Hall was built to make you feel small in the best possible way. The ceiling was so far above us that it had developed its own atmospheric conditions, faint wisps of mist drifting at the heights where the heating systems could not quite compensate. The walls were covered in panels of something that was not quite stone and not quite glass, each one engraved with the history of the Galactic Council in scripts from 24 languages. The floor was white, and so deeply polished that it caught every face and every light, and gave them back in slightly distorted reflection, so that you were always, wherever you stood, looking at a version of yourself that was not quite right. I had been standing in the center of it for 14 minutes, and the ceremonial shoes they had given me were too narrow, and I was thinking about that more than I probably should have been. The High Arbiter of the Galactic Council stood at the main podium. It had 4 arms, a face that had been described somewhere in my briefing documents as classically distinguished in the way of its species, and a voice that operated in 2 registers simultaneously, a lower tone and a higher one woven together, so that every word it spoke had the quality of something being harmonized. Its name contained clicking consonants and a tonal shift that I had practiced 30 times in my quarters and still could not reproduce correctly. I had taken to thinking of it simply as the Arbiter. It had never corrected me. It was reading my service record aloud. The record, as the Arbiter narrated it, sounded like something from a history of ancient heroes. It sounded like the kind of thing that was carved into stone so that future generations would know what was possible. The Arbiter read with slow, deliberate weight, pausing between passages to let the hall absorb them. I listened and recognized almost none of it. The Arbiter described how I had held the breach at Corridor 7 against a Shroud collective assault force 6 times the size of our unit, demonstrating what it called extraordinary tactical brilliance and unfailing commitment to the lives of those under my command. I remembered it as, the automated door was jammed in the open position, we had nothing on the other side of it, and we stood in that doorway and did what you do when there is no better option. We held. The Arbiter described how I had navigated the collapse of the tertiary hull section with calm and decisive precision, guiding 12 survivors through a structural failure while under fire. I remembered it as, the floor was going, the lights were gone, and I knew the layout because I had read the ship schematics twice out of boredom during transit. I walked and they followed. The Arbiter described my actions during the final engagement, the battle that had broken the Shroud Collective's advance and turned the war, and it used language so elevated that I started to wonder if there had been another human named Dara Cole at Yelthari who had done all of this much more dramatically than I had. But the hall was responding to every word as though it had been starving for exactly this story. The humming grew. The Keth ambassador pressed its 6-fingered hands together over its chest. 2 council representatives near the front made sounds I could only describe as weeping, and they were not trying to hide it. I stood in my 2 narrow shoes on the white floor and looked at my reflection, and thought about how strange it was to be the thing people had been waiting for when you had spent most of the relevant events simply trying to keep up. When the Arbiter finished, it turned those pale silver eyes to me and spoke in both its voices, and the hall fell into a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. Every consciousness in that room gathered itself and focused on what would come next. Sergeant Dara Cole, the Arbiter said, in the name of the Galactic Council, In the name of every civilized world that continues to exist because of the outcome of the Battle of Yelthari, we stand in your debt. We offer you the reward, freely given and freely chosen, in recognition of a service that has no adequate equivalent in the history of this body." It paused. "Name what you desire," it said, "and if it is within our power to grant, it will be done." The hall breathed. 47 civilizations, 300 sets of eyes, all of them waiting for me to name the shape of my ambition. I thought about the last 14 months. I thought about the narrow bunk in the shared quarters of the forward operating post, 3 inches of foam between me and the metal frame, the bunk above mine occupied by Private Garrett, who snored. I thought about the food, which had been adequate and nothing more for a very long time. I thought about the noise of a military station, which never fully stopped, and about the way you started to dream about silence, the way other people dreamed about beautiful things. I thought about the smell of my own quarters, which were clean but not ventilated, and about the cold that crept under the door from the corridor, and about the light that came on in the morning before I was ready for it. I thought about what I actually needed. "I would like 2 weeks of leave," I said. "A private room with a real bed, and something cold to drink that is not nutrient-paced." The silence did a specific thing. It did not end. It deepened. It became the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people reaches the same conclusion, at the same moment, and none of them know what to do with it. I watched the Arbiter's expression work through several phases of response. It arrived at something that, on a human face, I would have called controlled bewilderment. It began, and stopped, collected itself, tried again. "The generosity of your request is, or a week," I said. "I understand if the schedule is complicated. I am genuinely flexible." The Keth ambassador made a sound that my chip rendered as untranslatable, but that I would have described, phonetically, as the sound of someone stepping on an unexpected stair in the dark. Several beings near the front exchanged looks with the careful lateral eye movement of people who are communicating, without wanting to be seen communicating. One of the mall representatives stopped humming, and in the sudden absence of its portion of the chord, the whole delegation's tone changed. The Arbiter straightened all 4 of its arms, arranged the dignity back across its face, and spoke with the particular composure of someone who has chosen, deliberately, not to address what has just happened. "We are honored by your modesty," it said. "Nonetheless, the reward has been prepared in advance of this ceremony." The council undertook extensive deliberation. "We considered the qualities you have demonstrated, the nature of what you have achieved, the kind of being who does what you have done. We reached a consensus about what such a being would most wish for, what would be worthy of the scale of the gift." I felt the first small movement of something that was not quite dread, but was adjacent to it. "What kind of consensus?" I asked. "That a warrior of your character would desire power," the Arbiter said, with the certainty of someone reciting a conclusion that had been carefully reasoned to. "Legacy. A force at your disposal that would extend your reach across the galaxy and ensure that your name, and the name of your species, was recorded permanently in galactic memory. We prepared accordingly." I opened my mouth to say that I had not, at any point in my life, desired any of those things. I had desired, at various times, adequate sleep, functional footwear, and a meal that was not engineered for maximum nutritional efficiency, at the cost of every other quality food could have. But something moved at the far end of the hall before I could speak. The audience did not part quickly. That would have been too obvious, too clearly afraid. They parted carefully, the way crowds move in the presence of something that has not yet decided whether it is interested in them, and they are not willing to attract its attention by moving wrong. A path opened from the entrance to the center of the hall, and down that path came 8 council guards in full ceremonial armor, moving in practiced formation around a transport vessel that was roughly the size and shape of a large ground vehicle. The vessel was matte black, the kind of black that did not reflect anything. It had no visible seams, no external controls, no markings I recognized. It was covered in symbols that were not any script in my translation chip's database, and this told me, more clearly than the guards or the formation, that what was in the vessel was old enough to predate the systems my chip used, old enough to have existed before the notation of whatever language those symbols belonged to had been standardized. It hummed, not loudly, not in any way that would register on a standard sensor sweep, but at a frequency that lived in the body rather than in the ear, in the chest, somewhere behind the sternum, that is not quite the heart, but is near it. The guards placed it 10 meters in front of me and stepped back immediately, with the efficiency of people who have practiced this motion and are glad that the practicing is over. I looked at the vessel. Through a narrow panel of dark glass near its upper section, I could see a shape inside. Tall, still, looking back at me. The arbiter said, "Sergeant Cole, we give you the last bound Vethkari in known existence. The bonding rite has been completed, according to all required protocols, confirmed by 3 independent galactic authorities, and witnessed by this assembly. By the terms of the rite, he is bonded to your will. He cannot harm you. He cannot act against your interests. His strength is yours to direct. There is nothing in our power to offer that is more significant than this." The hall was completely silent. I looked at the vessel. I looked at the shape inside it. I looked at the narrow panel of dark glass, and I thought about the word he, and what it meant for an ancient, presumably non-human predator to be assigned a pronoun that I understood. "What," I said, quietly and clearly, "is a Vethkari?" The arbiter said, "An ancient being, one of the oldest known living species, predatory in nature, though the form of that predation is complex. They predate most current civilizations by many thousands of years, possibly longer. They were believed to be extinct. This one is the last surviving member of his kind." "Predatory," I said. "Yes. He is bonded to my will. By ancient right, yes. Meaning he is compelled to follow my direction. The bond compels it. He cannot act against your well-being. He cannot harm you." "Cannot," I said, "or will not." The arbiter paused. "The distinction is maintained by the right," it said, carefully. I looked back at the vessel, at the dark glass, at the shape behind it, which had not moved a millimeter in the several minutes since the guards had positioned it in front of me, which had the quality of stillness that is not rest but readiness, the specific stillness of something that is waiting, with a great deal of patience, because it has had a very long time to practice patience, and has decided, for now, to allow events to proceed without its interference. "I want a refund," I said. No one laughed. I had not expected them to, but something shifted in the collective emotional register of the hall, in a way I could not easily name, a kind of recalibration, as though 300 different minds had just updated their assessment of me, in ways that varied significantly by species, but shared a common thread of something between confusion and alarm. The arbiter said, with the patience of someone who has decided that this conversation is going to require more patience than they had originally allocated, "The rite has been completed. Both parties are bound. It cannot be undone without the agreement of both parties." "Both parties," I said. "Yes. Has he agreed to it being undone?" "He has not been asked." "Why not?" The arbiter made a sound I had not heard it make before. It was very brief and very controlled, but it was definitely there. "In the history of the rite," it said, "no one has ever asked." I thought about that. I thought about the shape behind the dark glass, which was still not moving, which was absolutely listening to every word of this conversation. I turned back to the vessel and walked toward it. The guards made sounds. One of them moved forward and another caught its arm, and I kept walking. I stopped in front of the dark glass panel. Up close, through the glass, I could see him properly for the first time. He was tall in the way that some things are tall, not just the measurement of it but the quality. Built with the proportions of something that has decided, at some point so far back that the decision has become simply structural, that it will not be stopped by most things, and has arranged its body to reflect that. His face was angular in the precise way of things made with specific intention, every line of it doing something necessary. His skin was a shade of gray that seemed to move when I looked at it directly, like stone seen through water, like it held light differently from different angles. His hands, at his sides, were long-fingered and very still. His eyes were looking directly into mine. They were the color of the space between stars, not black, nothing as simple as black. The specific color of the gap between things, where light has not arrived, and you are not certain it is coming, vast and particular at once. He was looking at me with an expression that I had absolutely no difficulty reading. After 6,000 years of existence, apparently some expressions achieved a universality that transcended species. That expression, on that face, looking at me through that dark glass, said, "This is not what I would have chosen." Which, I thought, made two of us. I turned back to the Arbiter. I said, "I am going to need a significantly larger living space. Someone is going to provide me with a complete briefing on the Vethkari, the right, and what the practical day-to-day implications of this situation are. And that briefing will happen tonight." The Arbiter said, "Of course. And I still want the leave," I said. 2 weeks. Starting now. I am not attending any further ceremonies or making any further appearances until I have had consecutive hours of sleep measured in the double digits. The Arbiter said, "We will arrange everything." I turned to the transport vessel one more time. I looked at the dark glass. I said, quietly enough that it was between me and whoever was behind that panel, "I did not ask for this. I understand you did not ask for it either. I think we should acknowledge that before we figure out anything else. Nothing about this situation is your fault or mine. Let's try to deal with it like that." The shape behind the glass did not respond, did not move, did not give me anything to read in its expression beyond the existing expression, which was still deeply and specifically unimpressed. But something in those light gap eyes did something. Not warm, not open, but not entirely closed either. I picked up the handle on the transport vessel, because someone had to, and I walked out of the Grand Conclave Hall with the last Vethkari in existence, pulling him on a wheeled base across polished white stone, while 300 alien dignitaries stood in perfect silence and watched us go. I found out later that they were not silent because they were processing what they had witnessed. They were silent because they were genuinely afraid. Not of him, of what it meant that I was not. In 6,000 years, no one had walked up to a bound Vethkari and spoken to him through the glass like a reasonable person addressing another reasonable person. Not because it was forbidden, because the people who encountered Vethkari were usually too terrified to think of it, and the people who were not terrified were usually too arrogant to bother. I had not known any of this at the time. I had known that my shoes were too narrow and I was tired and I wanted to sleep for a week. But sometimes the things you do out of simple practical exhaustion turn out to be the things that change everything. I would think about that later. A lot. The habitat they assigned me occupied a full section of the diplomatic ring on Yelthari Station. 14 rooms. I counted them that first evening, moving through each doorway with a cup of the hot drink I had finally convinced the unfamiliar kitchen to produce, trying to understand why any single entity would need this much space. There was the main living area, large enough to hold a gathering of 12 without crowding. There was the sleep room, which had a bed that was actually built for human proportions, which I had not slept in yet, because I had been too disoriented to commit to sleeping. 3 rooms whose purpose I could not determine from inspection. Possibly they were meant for display, or work, or hosting, or some combination of those things depending on what species occupied the habitat. A bath chamber that was very large and had more controls than I had time to learn. 2 smaller adjoining rooms that seemed designed for intimate meetings or quiet sitting. A storage corridor. A room with a floor-to-ceiling view panel facing outward toward open space, which gave an unobstructed look at stars and the curved edge of the planet below. And 3 more rooms that I had no framework for at all, and eventually designated, mentally, as rooms the habitat included, because it had been designed by someone who believed that rooms were inherently positive. On any objective measure, it was the most space I had ever had access to in my life. On the mining colony where I grew up, my family had occupied 600 square feet shared between 5 people, and we had been considered comfortable by the standards of that particular colony. In the brigade, I had slept in a bunk 3 feet wide, in a shared quarters, with 7 other people for 14 months. The habitat's sleep room alone was larger than my family's entire living space had been. I should have felt luxurious in it. Instead, I moved through the rooms feeling the particular unease of too much quiet in too much space, the way the silence had a different texture when there were no walls close enough to bounce it back. The transport vessel was in the 3rd of the unidentifiable rooms, which had been the only space with enough floor area and ceiling height to accommodate it properly. The Council's installation team had spent 2 hours briefing me that first afternoon. They were thorough. They covered the release mechanism, the monitoring protocols, the right parameters, the behavioral constraints in detail, They had a presentation, which they delivered with the seriousness of people who wanted to be very certain I understood what I was being left alone with. By the end of it, I had understood the following key points. Sael Vorath could not harm me. He could not take any action that would directly damage my well-being. Beyond those two constraints, the bond placed no further restrictions on what he could do. He could speak, move freely throughout the habitat, leave the vessel whenever he chose, now that the vessel was registered to my living space, exist however he wished, without limitation, as long as the two constraints held. The bond, they explained, was two-directional. It did not merely prevent him from harming me, it also created a resonance between his nature and mine. In my immediate presence, his abilities, the abilities that made a Vethkari something the rest of the galaxy was deeply reluctant to encounter, were suppressed. He could not use them against me, and in the zone of our proximity, the area within approximately 20 meters where the resonance was strongest, he could not easily use them against anyone. This was the reason the Council had considered the arrangement a gift rather than a burden. I was walking around with the galaxy's most dangerous predator as a permanent companion who could not, near me, be dangerous. I could see the logic. I did not feel entirely settled by it. I read until late that first night, going through everything in the available files about the Vethkari. What I found was not reassuring in the conventional sense, but it was clear, and I have always preferred clarity to comfortable uncertainty. The Vethkari were old, genuinely, documentably old, older than the written records of most current civilizations, older than the Galactic Council itself, older than the trade routes, and the diplomatic frameworks, and the accumulated agreements that held the known galaxy in its current configuration. The earliest verified accounts of Vethkari encounters dated from a period when most current species were still in their pre-civilization stages. They sustained themselves on conscious energy. This is the part the documents tried to explain carefully, with several paragraphs of scientific framing that I ultimately distilled to its essential meaning. They fed on the experience of fear, not blood, not physical matter, not any substance I had a simple word for. The emotional and cognitive experience of fear, specifically the kind generated by conscious minds. They were apex predators of inner experience. They could project into the psychological space of a being near them, amplify existing fears, locate the specific shape of what a person most dreaded, and make it feel not like imagination, but like reality. The accounts of early encounters were genuinely harrowing. Colony ships, exploration vessels, civilizations that had flourished until they encountered a Vethkari in the deep space that was that being's territory. The survivors, when there were survivors, described not physical injury but something more difficult to name, a completeness of fear that had changed them, not broken them externally, changed them internally in ways that did not fully heal. I put the documents down at some point after midnight and sat for a while with my cup and the quiet of the habitat and thought about the being in the sealed vessel in the third room down the corridor. I did not feel afraid. I noticed this, and I examined it honestly, and I concluded that it was not bravado or denial. It was simply that my baseline experience of the world had, for most of my life, included a fairly constant level of background tension. The colony, the brigade, the accumulated experience of living in environments where attention to potential danger was survival behavior, not anxiety. The fear response that most beings carried as an exception, activated by specific threats, was for me something closer to a constant companion, and a constant companion loses the power to startle. On the first morning, I woke up before the alarm I had set, which was normal for me, and which I had long since stopped fighting. I made the hot drink on the second attempt, having learned from the first. I drank it standing at the window in the living area, watching the station's rotation carry the view from stars to the curve of the planet and back. Then, I went to check on the vessel. The vessel was open, the restraints were retracted, the interior was empty. I stood in the doorway of the room and processed this information calmly, which took a moment. Then I turned around. He was in the main corridor behind me, standing in the way that he stood, the way I had already started, in just 18 hours, to recognize as his, completely upright, hands at his sides, still in the way of something that has chosen stillness, rather than being incapable of movement. He was wearing the plain dark clothing that I had asked the installation team to include in the habitat supply, because I had thought that leaving him no option but ceremonial dress would be both impractical and, for reasons I could not fully articulate, unkind. He looked at me. I looked back at him. Up close, in the full light of the habitat corridor rather than through dark glass, he was more precisely detailed than I had been able to observe before. The way his skin shifted color slightly with the light. Not iridescent, nothing as decorative as that, more like the surface behavior of something very dense responding to different wavelengths. The architecture of his face, which was not quite any geometry I had encountered in any species before, every angle doing what it needed to do without excess. Those eyes, which in this lighting were even more specifically the color I had tried to name before, not empty, not dark, the color of the gap between stars. He said nothing. "Good morning," I said. He said nothing. "I don't know what you eat," I said. The briefing documents mentioned that the Vethkari process energy differently from most species, but they weren't specific about the practical side of that. If there is something I can provide that would help, I'd like to know what it is. No response. "There's a room with a better view if you'd prefer it," I said. "The one I'm in faces the interior corridor. There's one that faces out to open space. Given what I know about where your species has historically lived, I thought you might find that preferable." His eyes moved. Just briefly, just enough for me to track the direction, toward the window he could not see from the corridor, the window that faced the stars. I took that as communication. I spent the rest of the morning reading, and left the view room door open. By the end of the first full day, he had not spoken. By the end of the third day, he had still not spoken. But he had, at various points, been in different rooms of the habitat, which told me he was moving freely. He had been in the view room for most of the daylight hours. He had been in the corridor outside the kitchen at one point, when I was making food, which I interpreted as either curiosity or strategic positioning, and chose not to overthink. On the fourth day, I was eating at the kitchen table, when he appeared in the doorway. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold the way he had in the corridor on the first morning. Present, observing, not committing. I said, without looking up, "Sit down." A pause. Then the sound of the chair at the end of the table, which was not across from me, and not adjacent, but the most ambiguous distance the table allowed. I finished my meal, cleared the dish, came back with a refill of my drink, sat down and said, "The briefing documents say you understand 64 languages currently spoken in the galactic community. That figure," he said, "is imprecise." His voice was the first thing he had given me that I had not been able to anticipate. I had expected, based on nothing I could have justified, something deeper. What I got was clear and low and controlled, with a quality like a note played on an old instrument that has had a very long time to find its proper resonance. "How so?" I asked. "It should be 64, plus the number of languages spoken in this room," he said, "which brings the total to 65. I looked at him. "You count English." "I count every language I have encountered," he said, "including those I have encountered recently." "When did you learn English?" "During the ceremony," he said. It was sufficient time. I sat with that for a moment. He had been in a sealed transport vessel during the ceremony. He had, apparently, learned a human language from ambient exposure during the time it took the arbiter to read my service record. "How many total?" I asked, "including the ones that aren't current." He paused, briefly. 212, approximately. Some belong to civilizations that no longer exist. Dead languages. Languages of dead civilizations, he said. The distinction is meaningful. A language is not dead as long as one speaker remains. I looked at him across the table. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the surface of the table, in the way of someone who is not really looking at what they appear to be looking at. "Will you tell me a word?" I asked. "From one of them. Something that doesn't translate well into the current common tongues." The silence that followed was long enough that I began to think he was simply not going to answer. I had started to move on in my own mind when he spoke. Sounds I could not have reproduced or transcribed. A phrase that rose and fell in a way that felt like breathing slowed down. "What does it mean?" I asked. "Approximately," he said. "It refers to the specific grief of outliving something you never expected to love." I set down my cup. "That is one word," I said. "One concept rendered in a language that did not separate grief and love into different categorical experiences, he said. They were considered too functionally related for distinct notation. Which civilization? The table surface apparently became somewhat less interesting than it had been, because he looked up. The El Shara, he said. The name landed in the room with a different weight than the other things he had said. I could hear it in his voice, not a breaking of the controlled register, not anything as visible as emotion, but a density, something present in the word that was not present in the others. What happened to them? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. They were ended, he said, by something that came from beyond the veil, something very old and very specific in what it does. I did not ask more. I had the clear sense that more was there to be asked, and that it was not the right moment to ask it. The word he had given me, the grief of outliving something you never expected to love, was sitting in the room between us, and I understood that it was not only a definition. Thank you, I said, for telling me. He looked at me briefly, with an expression I could not catalogue, and then looked away. I refilled my cup and went back to the reports on my screen, and we sat in the same room for another 2 hours, without speaking, and it was the first time the habitat had not felt too large. The days that followed built on that first conversation, in the incremental way of things that grow without being directed. He began appearing in the common room during my evening review of intelligence and tactical reports, a habit I had developed in the brigade as a way of staying current, and had continued out of routine. I read them aloud, partly because spoken words processed differently than read ones, and partly because the silence was less strange when there was something in it. On the third evening of this, without preamble, he said, "Your analysis of the Keth border situation is built on incorrect assumptions about their movement pattern." I looked up. He explained, in the same level, precise voice he used for everything, why the movement I had interpreted as expansion was actually a controlled retreat, and how he knew this, drawing on historical patterns from a civilization that had performed the same maneuver 4,000 years ago for the same strategic reasons. He was specific. He was detailed. He was, I realized, very good at this. I started keeping a separate document for his observations. He noticed this and said nothing about it, but became more specific in his corrections afterward, which told me he had noticed. This was, in retrospect, the moment things became something I did not have a prior category for. Not friendship in the simple sense, not the dynamic of a bound being and their bondholder, something that was being built between us in real time, out of the particular materials of who we each were, and that looked like nothing else I had experienced before. The incident that forced the next stage happened on a Thursday, as I measured time on station, at the end of my 6th week in the habitat. I had gone to the market sector, as I had developed the habit of doing twice a week. The market was loud and genuine, in the way that markets everywhere are genuine. People trying to exchange things they have for things they need, without ceremony, without performance, just the honest transaction of existence. I found it settling in a way the diplomatic portions of the station were not. I was in the back corridor of Section 4, on my way home, when I turned a corner and found 3 Keth crime syndicate members who had, according to the intelligence reports I had been reading for 3 weeks, been operating in that exact sector. The one at the front had a disruption device, standard issue for organizations that want compliance without visible damage. In most species, it produced immediate disorientation, a shutdown of the higher cognitive functions, sometimes unconsciousness. In humans, it produced a brief buzzing in the back teeth and a mild headache. He activated it directly into my face and watched me not fall down. The expression that crossed his face was one of the purest forms of recalculation I had ever witnessed. He had planned for this moment. His plan had stopped working before it properly started. He was now on an unscripted version of events he had not prepared for. The second and third members moved. I will not pretend the next several minutes were comfortable. There were 3 of them. I was carrying a bag of market goods, and Keth musculature is genuinely impressive in close quarters. I managed to get 2 of them into positions they had not intended to be in, which took all of my concentration and most of my available leverage, and the third came at me from an angle I had not left enough attention to cover. His grip on my arm was the kind of grip that does not negotiate. And then the corridor went dark. This darkness was nothing like a power failure. Power failures cut the light and leave the air unchanged. This darkness was itself a presence. It had texture, depth, direction. It was not the absence of light, but the arrival of something that made light temporarily less relevant. It was the dark that exists at the outer edge of very old things, the dark that has context and intent. The grip disappeared. There was a sound that I do not have precise language for, and will not try to describe beyond saying that it was brief, and it was effective. The lights came back. All three Keth Syndicate members were at the far wall of the corridor, having arrived there with speed and without choosing to. Two of them were sorting out their orientation from a position low to the ground. The third had decided the ground was fine as a destination, and had not amended this decision. Sael was in the corridor. He was the same as always, still, controlled, the calm of something that has never needed to perform its own capability, because its capability was always simply present. He looked at me the way he always did, direct, evaluating, undisturbed by any of what had just occurred. "Thank you," I said. "The right compels me to prevent harm to you," he said. "It compels you to prevent harm," I said. "It does not specify the manner, or the speed." He looked at me. "You went well beyond the minimum," I said. He said, "I do not do things halfway." We walked back to the habitat. I made 2 cups of the hot drink and put one on the table in front of him and sat down. He looked at the cup for a moment, then wrapped both hands around it, which was something he had started doing recently. Not drinking, just holding. The gesture of someone who has been somewhere that had no warmth in it for a long time, and is not yet ready to put down the warm thing. "Sael," I said. He looked at me. "The word you taught me, the Ale Shara one." He waited. "You said you had been thinking about whether it could face forward as well as back," I said. "Whether it applied to more than memory." He was quiet. "I did say that," he said. "I think it can," I said. "I think that is what precise languages are built for. Every direction." He looked at me for a long moment. Something was moving in his expression, something that had been very carefully behind a door for a long time, and was not opening, but was, perhaps, becoming less certain that it needed to stay closed. "Perhaps," he said. I finished my drink. He held his. The station turned and the stars moved past the view panel, and the habitat was quiet in the way it had started to be quiet. Not the too large quiet of the first days, but something closer to the quiet of a place that has been lived in. I was beginning to understand that something was happening between us that I did not have the right vocabulary for yet. But I had the sense that the vocabulary was coming. The signal arrived during a routine briefing. It presented itself as interference at first, the kind of low-level static that appeared occasionally in deep space sensor readings, cosmic background noise, from events too distant and too large for our instruments to resolve cleanly. The duty officer noted it in the log and moved on. The second detection, 4 hours later, changed the classification. The noise had a pattern, not the irregular distribution of natural interference, but a sequence, repeating, embedded in a frequency band that did not correspond to any known artificial signal. The attending technician flagged it with one level of concern. By the time the briefing officer received the compiled data the next morning and presented it to the assembled intelligence staff in the main situation room, the concern had become 2 levels. I was in the back of the room when she presented it. I had been attending these briefings for 6 weeks, first as an observer and increasingly as a contributor, and I had developed a sense for the difference between concerning news and news that had shifted the emotional calibration of the room at a deeper level. This was the second kind. Sael was beside me. He went still in the instant she displayed the signal pattern on the main screen. Not his working stillness, not the conserved readiness that was his everyday state. This was different. This was recognition. The complete, immediate recognition of something encountered before, something that the body knows before the mind has finished processing. He stood up and walked out of the briefing room. I followed. In the corridor, I stepped in front of him. He stopped. His eyes were focused on something I could not see, or on something he was seeing that the corridor did not contain. His hands were at his sides, and the air around him had the quality it sometimes had in moments of intensity, a density and directionality that I had come to recognize as the outer edge of whatever he was. Not threatening, just present. "Tell me," I said. "The Null Choir," he said. I had seen the name in one of the deep historical files. A reference. A passing notation in a document. So old that the dating system had stopped trying to be precise about it. I had read it and moved on, as one moves on from things that are listed as mythological. The historical files describe them as a myth, I said. The historical files were written by civilizations young enough to mistake memory for myth, he said. His voice was level. Under the level was something I was only able to identify because I had been paying attention to him for 6 weeks, and I knew, by now, how things were different when they mattered to him. Under the level was worry, genuine worry. The Null Choir are not mythological. I know them because I have encountered them, not from records, not from historical accounts. I was present when they arrived, the last time. When the Ale Shara ended, I said. He looked at me. He had not expected me to make that connection immediately. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the specific response of someone who finds themselves understood at a moment when they expected to need to explain. Yes, he said. Tell me everything, I said. Now, all of it. We went to a side room and he told me. The Null Choir were not conquerors. This was the first and most important distinction, and it was the reason that every standard response the Council would be considering was already wrong. Conquerors wanted things: territory, resources, submission, tribute. Conquerors could be negotiated with, because negotiation was structured around the concept of wanting, and conquerors had wants. The Null Choir did not want. They unmade. They arrived in a region of space where civilization existed, and they reduced it, systematically and completely, to the state that preceded civilization, not ruins. Ruins implied structural residue, the evidence of what had been. The Null Choir reduced things to their pre-construction state: cities, accumulated knowledge, the infrastructure of thousands of years of developed society. Gone, not destroyed, restored to the condition of the raw material before anyone had done anything with it. The Ale Shara had been a civilization of approximately 9 billion people, Sael said, spread across 4 inhabited planets and 17 subsidiary stations and orbital habitats. They had existed for 6,000 years. Their language had been precise enough to contain words for things most languages never needed to name: their art, their philosophy, their accumulated understanding of mathematics and biology, and the nature of consciousness. All of it had been present in the galaxy for 6,000 years. After the Null Choir had passed through the Ale Shara's region of space, nothing remained. The planets were there. The moons, the asteroid fields, the raw astronomical geography of that star system, all present, undamaged. The civilization that had lived in it was simply absent, as if it had never been there, as if the 6,000 years had not happened. Sael had been present. He did not elaborate on what that had been, exactly. He did not need to. I could infer it from the word he had taught me. The grief of outliving something you never expected to love. The word that faced backward in memory. Conventional weapons, I said, when he paused. Entirely ineffective, he said. The Null Choir exist at a resonance frequency that modern technology cannot access. Every weapon system in the current galactic arsenal operates in the physical spectrum. The Null Choir do not fully occupy the physical spectrum. What spectrum do they occupy? The same one I do, he said. The frequency of the old world. The energy that exists beneath and between the physical. The spectrum of things that were present before the current age of the galaxy took its current shape. I looked at him. You can engage them, I said. Yes. You are the only thing in the known galaxy that can engage them. Currently, he said. Yes. Then tell me what you need. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not immediately decode. It was the expression of someone who is about to ask for something they do not know how to ask for, which is difficult for most people, and was, I suspected, more difficult for him than for most. The use of the old power, he said, requires an anchor. I waited. When a Vethkari reaches into the old frequency, he said, carefully, the resonance does not remain contained. It expands outward. It enters the psychological space of every conscious mind within range. The experience of that resonance is extreme. It confronts every mind it touches with the deepest possible form of fear. Not a specific fear, the essential fear. The fear that exists at the boundary of what consciousness can contain. The awareness that the universe is vastly older, vastly stranger, and vastly less concerned with any individual mind than that mind can fully hold. That breaks people, I said. It ends them, he said quietly, not physically, but in the ways that matter. An anchor is someone who holds stable, I said. Someone the resonance passes through without creating collapse. Yes, he said. And you need the anchor to be physically present. The resonance propagates from my location outward, he said. A stable mind at the center allows the power to hold its shape. Without a stable anchor, the resonance becomes a wave, with no directed form. It reaches everything within range equally, everyone within several kilometers. I thought about this carefully. I thought about what stable meant in the context of facing the deepest possible fear at the edge of what consciousness could contain. You need someone whose fear response is already at its baseline maximum, I said. Someone whose psychological state doesn't spike under extreme pressure because it is already, in ordinary circumstances, running at capacity. Sale looked at me. The expression on his face was one I had not seen before. Beneath the control, beneath the long practice of a being who had kept everything internal for longer than most civilizations had been writing things down, was something that looked, if you were familiar enough with him to see it, like the specific pain of needing something and knowing exactly where it is, and knowing what it costs the person who has it to give it. You need me, I said. I need, he said, with great precision, your frankly inexplicable nervous system. I almost smiled. That is the most complicated compliment I have ever received. It is not a compliment, he said. It is a description. Is there anyone else? I said. Any chance I am not the right choice for this? I have been in your presence for 6 weeks, he said. I have observed you in circumstances that would produce significant measurable psychological distress in any documented sentient species. You do not spike. When pressure increases, your emotional range contracts rather than expands. Your baseline anxiety is so consistent that it has become its own form of stability. He paused. I have not encountered this in 6,000 years. Diagnosis confirmed, I said. What are the risks to you? He was quiet. I asked about the risks to you, I said. Not to me. What happens to you in this process? He looked at me with the expression of someone who had prepared for many possible responses and had not fully prepared for this particular one. Tell me, I said. He told me. All of it. The reaching into the old frequency was not neutral for him. It was the reaching of a being into its own deepest nature, a nature that had been suppressed and bound and contained for longer than it was designed to hold. The release of it, even directed and purposeful, left marks. Not permanent damage, not the kind of thing that could be pointed to and named clearly, but the equivalent of what humans sometimes described when they talked about the long weight of carrying something very heavy. You put it down, and you are not injured, but you are not the same as before you picked it up. 6,000 years of carrying things, and now this. All right, I said, when he had finished. He looked at me. All right, I said again. We're going. You tell me everything about the process as we prepare. I need to know every stage of what is happening so I can respond correctly. And you do not, at any point, make decisions about what I should or should not be told in order to protect me from information. I need all of it. He studied me for a long moment. You are not afraid, he said. Not an accusation, not quite admiration, something in between those things that had no direct name. I didn't say that, I said. I am going to be afraid. That's fine. Fear and action are not mutually exclusive. I was afraid every day, for 14 months, and I did my job every one of those days. Being afraid just means you are paying appropriate attention. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I have never met a human before you. I know, I said. I have now formed a conclusion about them, he said. Which is? That they are strange, he said, in ways I did not anticipate. Unflattering or otherwise, I said. He considered. Otherwise, he said. We went to the council chamber without requesting an audience. We walked in. The arbiter looked up, saw us standing there together, me in my uniform, Sael at his full height with the particular quality of presence he had when he had made a decision, and had the good sense to skip the protocol. The null choir, I said. We have been in emergency session, the arbiter said. We do not have a response strategy. We do, I said. We need a vessel. Small, maneuverable, fully fueled and ready within 12 hours. No crew. A direct communication lock to this station, for situation reporting only. And someone to monitor the Council's internal channels and prevent any well-intentioned unilateral actions while we are outside sensor range. The Arbiter looked at me. At sail. Back at me. The risk to both of you, it began, is known, I said. We are going anyway. Sail said nothing. He stood beside me with his hands behind his back and his gaze on the Arbiter with the directness of something that has spent a very long time waiting for the right moment to be used correctly and has arrived at that moment and is not going to be redirected. The Arbiter let out a breath. The vessel will be ready in 10 hours, it said. We left. In the corridor outside the council chamber, walking back toward the docking section, Sael said, "You told them we are going anyway." "We are," I said. "You did not consult me first." "I thought we had already consulted," I said. "In the side room, an hour ago." A pause. "We had," he said. "Then I was not telling them something without your agreement," I said. "I was telling them something we had already decided." Another pause. "Yes," he said. "That is correct." We prepared for 10 hours. He told me everything about the process, every stage, everything I would experience, and everything I needed to do and not do. I listened, and I asked questions, and I memorized the answers, and I did not pretend to be less nervous than I was, because pretending would have been dishonest, and dishonesty in this particular preparation would have been dangerous. When we boarded the vessel, he said, once, quietly, "You do not have to do this." "Neither do you," I said. He looked at me. "But we're going," I said. "Yes," he said, "we are." We undocked. The station fell away behind us, and the open space of the deep corridor between systems opened ahead, and somewhere in the dark beyond our sensors, the null choir were moving toward the inner systems, with the patient, purposeful certainty of things that have done this before and have never been adequately stopped. We flew toward them. I kept my hands steady on the console, and my breathing even, and my fear at its comfortable, familiar 7. We were going to be enough. I did not know that yet with certainty, but I believed it. That was, I had learned, usually sufficient. The void that the null choir brought with them was not visible on the sensors in any conventional way. It appeared on the display as an absence, a region where the data returned by our instruments was not incorrect but was incomplete, as if something in that region was declining to be measured in the standard ways. The edges of the region were not defined by a line or a boundary, but by a gradient, a slow thickening of the instrument's uncertainty that became, at the center, a complete refusal. I had been in combat. I had been in situations that my body had correctly assessed as serious, where the information my senses were sending me was, "Something here wants to end you, and it is very capable." I knew what that felt like. I had a calibrated response to it that did not involve freezing or running, but involved a contraction of focus and a slowing of unnecessary thought, and a commitment to the next practical action. This was not that. This was something adjacent, but different. This was the feeling that the context in which all those previous dangerous situations had occurred, the physical universe, matter and energy, and the physics I had been operating within since birth, was itself contingent on something I did not understand, and that something was in that region of incomplete data on my screen, and it was very old, and it was not interested in being measured. I breathed in, I breathed out. My baseline was a 7. It moved to an 8. I kept my hands on the console. Sael was standing at the front viewport, looking at the region the sensors couldn't properly map. He had been still since we cleared the last navigation marker. Not his usual stillness, something deeper than that. Something like the stillness of a long distance between a point of departure and a point of arrival. The stillness of someone who has been in motion for so long that arriving at the destination changes the quality of the air around them. He turned to look at me. "I am going to begin," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm ready. If you feel the resonance become something you cannot hold, you'll know before I will," I said. "You are monitoring from the inside. If it becomes a problem, you will see it before I feel it becoming unmanageable. Stop if you need to stop. That was not the point I was making, he said. I know, I said. I know what point you were making. But my answer is the same. He looked at me for a moment, with the expression that I had been watching develop for 6 weeks. The one that faced forward instead of back. The one that belonged to the word that applied to anticipation rather than memory. Then he turned back to the viewport and reached into himself for whatever it was he carried that was older than the current age of the galaxy. The cabin changed. It did not change visibly. The lights were the same. The instruments continued their steady reporting. The vessel continued its heading. What changed was the quality of the air, the quality of the space inside the small cabin, the way the ambient existence of everything in it became, suddenly, more present, more specific, as though whatever Sael was reaching into was making the reality around it more real, in the way that a very old frequency can cause things to resonate that were previously simply present. The resonance began. I had been told to expect something like the sensation of standing at the edge of a high place. What I felt was more precisely accurate than that description. It was like standing at the edge of a high place and understanding, in absolute detail, exactly how high it was, and exactly what was below, and exactly what falling from it would entail, and understanding all of this not as an intellectual exercise but as pure sensation, the sensation of a consciousness encountering the full, unfiltered information of its own smallness, relative to the structure of what contains it. The universe was very large. The universe had been here for longer than any unit of measurement that consciousness had invented remained meaningful. The universe would continue after every structure of organized matter that had ever thought of itself as important had dispersed into the equilibrium that was entropy's promised destination. This was not frightening to me in the way I think it was designed to be frightening. I was already familiar with being small. I had grown up small, 5 people in 600 square feet, a colony on a rock orbiting a middle-aged star, a planet that was one of hundreds of billions, in one of hundreds of billions of galaxy formations, in a universe whose scale my brain could represent numerically, but not genuinely hold. I had always lived with the knowledge of smallness. It was not news. It was just the context. My fear sat at an 8. It did not move. Sael said my name. Here, I said. Hold, he said. Holding, I said. What happened in the deep corridor between us and the null choir's current position was something I observed from a particular vantage point, not from outside it, not from a position of comprehensive understanding, but from the inside of a small cabin, with my hands on a console, and my breathing even, and my fear at an 8. The old power expanded outward from Sael, in the way he had described, but experiencing it from the inside was different from the description. It was not aggressive. That was the thing I had not anticipated. It was not the expansion of something attacking. It was the expansion of something being recognized, like a frequency that had been silent for a very long time, making itself present again, in the space that had always been built to contain it. The null choir responded. The instruments registered nothing. The sensor returns remained their incomplete selves, declining to be measured in standard ways. But I felt the response, not as sound, not as sensation on the skin, but in the same register that the resonance was operating in. The register of something very old, addressing something equally old in the language they shared. There was a period. I lost precise track of the duration, which the vessel's log later recorded as 41 minutes, during which the exchange occurred at that register, in that language, in a way I cannot accurately translate, because I do not have the grammar for it, and probably never will. I held my position. My hands were on the console. My fear was at an 8. Twice during those 41 minutes, the resonance expanded sharply, spiking beyond the level that Sael had been maintaining, and the quality of the cabin changed in ways that were not comfortable. The first time, I said his name, just his name, at normal volume. He said, from what felt like a great distance, "Here." "Still holding," I said. The resonance stabilized. The second time, I reached out and put my hand on his arm. He went still in a way that was different from all his other kinds of stillness. The still of something that has been given an unexpected weight and has not yet decided how to carry it, but has stopped moving in order to first understand that it is being carried. The resonance came back to its working level. I kept my hand where it was. He did not move away. At the 41st minute, the null choir withdrew, not fled. The word is too fast and too emotional. Withdrew is more accurate. A slow, deliberate recession, the way water pulls back before the next wave. Except there was not going to be a next wave. Not here. Not in this region. They had encountered the boundary that sail represented, the living reminder that the old world was not fully past, and they had made the decision that old things sometimes make when they encounter something older. They moved on. Sail came back to himself over the course of several minutes. The resonance dimmed. The quality of the cabin's air returned to something that my instruments could have measured as normal. The sensors began returning complete readings for the first time since we had entered this region. He sat down on the deck of the cabin, which I had never seen him do. I sat down beside him. We did not speak for a while. The instruments reported their complete, ordinary data. The stars were visible through the viewport, steady and patient and present. The distance we had traveled was not very far in galactic terms. The significance of what had occurred in it was something that would take longer to fully measure than I had available. "Did it work?" I said. "Yes," he said. "Are you hurt?" He was quiet for a moment. "I do not know yet. I will know over time." "All right," I said. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," I said. "Tired. But no." He nodded, once, looking at the viewport. His hands were on the deck in front of him. He looked, for the first time since I had known him, like something that had put down a very heavy thing. Not damaged, not diminished, just lighter than before, in a way that was going to take some getting used to. "Sael," I said. "Yes." "I need you to know something," I said. "Not because the situation requires it, just because I want to say it." He looked at me. "Sitting in that small ship going towards something the rest of the galaxy was retreating from," I said. "I was not alone. That mattered. Whatever happened in there, whatever you did, I was not in it alone. I want you to know that I know that." He looked at me for a long time, in the low light of the cabin, with the ordinary stars behind him, and the resonance fully gone from the air. His eyes were just his eyes. The color of the space between stars where the light has not yet reached. Present and specific and, at this moment, open in a way they had not been when I had first looked through dark glass and seen him looking back. "Nor was I," he said. We flew back to Yelthari Station in the silence that I had come to understand was not the absence of words, but the presence of something that words would eventually be adequate to, and we were not there yet, and we did not need to be. The Arbiter wanted ceremonies. 17 of them, by the final count, spread across 6 weeks, involving representatives of every civilization that had received warning of the Null Choir's retreat, and credited that retreat to the actions of 2 beings in a small vessel, in a deep corridor of space, that most sensor networks had not been properly monitoring at the time. We arrived to the first one 40 minutes late. The delay was my fault, which is to say it was both of our faults, which is to say it was an argument that neither of us had been able to resolve before the start time, and that we had elected to continue in transit without reaching any different conclusion. The argument was about the route I had taken through the Crescian Drift, on the way back from the Null Choir engagement. Sail's position was that the Crescian Drift was an active gravitational anomaly region, that its navigational complexity added unnecessary risk to any transit, and that the marginal time savings it offered did not justify the exposure to that risk. He had been specific. He had cited the documented loss rate of vessels that had used the drift as a navigation shortcut, going back approximately 400 years, and the comparison had not been flattering to my decision. My position was that the drift route had saved us 2.5 hours, that the documented loss rate was calculated across all vessels including those without competent pilots, and that at the speed we had been traveling, the gravitational variables had been well within manageable parameters. He said that manageable was not the same as wise. I said that wise was not the same as efficient. He said those were not the same thing either. I said that was very nearly my point. We arrived in the anteroom of the ceremony hall still going. The protocol officer who was waiting for us was a being of considerable professional composure, and they demonstrated that composure by waiting for us to finish the current exchange before clearing their throat gently and indicating that the hall was ready. The ceremony itself was the kind of thing that I had become somewhat practiced at tolerating. The Arbiter gave a speech. It was a good speech. The Arbiter was genuinely skilled at the form, and this speech in particular had a quality of sincerity that elevated it above the ceremonial standard. It described the engagement against the Null Choir in terms that were appropriately weighted. It named Sael Vorath first, which I thought was correct, because the power that had made the engagement possible was his, and that needed to be said clearly. It described what we had done as unprecedented. Several representatives in the hall used the word historic. The Keth ambassador, who cried as a matter of apparent biological habit, cried. I stood beside Sael and watched the room receive the story of what had happened, and I thought about how differently the story looked from inside it. From inside it, the story was two beings in a small ship, one of them very old and carrying something very heavy, one of them tired and afraid at an 8, and keeping her hands steady on the console. That was the whole story. It did not look, from the inside, like a historic event. It looked like what it was, the thing you do because it is the thing that needs doing, and you happen to be the person available to do it. Afterward, in the corridor, Sael said, You are thinking something. Always, I said. About the ceremony, he said. About the difference between how things look from outside and how they feel from inside, I said. The outside version is a historic event. The inside version is just the thing we did. He considered this. Both are accurate, he said. Yes, I said. But only one of them is the real memory. We walked toward the reception that was technically mandatory but that I had already decided would receive a limited portion of my evening. The corridor was long and well lit, and less crowded than the hall had been. Through a viewport at the far end, I could see the station's edge, and, beyond it, the unobstructed stars. The Arbiter offered me a position, I said. Permanent advisory role. Something about unique qualifications and experience that cannot be replicated. Sael said nothing, but the quality of his silence changed in the way that told me he was listening. Long-term assignment to the diplomatic and intelligence structure, I said. Access to full council resources, the ability to continue what we've been doing, formally, rather than as an improvised arrangement. And Harmon? He said. He had started using names, Harmons, a few others from my brigade, names I had mentioned often enough that he had catalogued them as relevant. She said to take it, I said. She said it in the way she says things when she thinks you already know what you should do, and she's just confirming. And do you? He said. I looked at the stars through the viewport. Yes, I said. I think I do. He was quiet for a moment. The rite has dissolved, he said. It was not the first time he had said this. He had told me on the vessel, on the way back, sitting on the deck. But he said it again now with a specific quality, as though the repetition served a purpose. I am under no obligation to remain in this arrangement. The bond is no longer active. I could... Sael, I said. He stopped. You told me on the ship, I said. When I asked if you were going to leave, you told me no. I did, he said. Has that changed? No, he said, without hesitation. The word came out at the speed of something that does not need to be thought about, because it is already the case. Then we are having a different conversation than the one you're pretending we're having, I said. He looked at me. You're not asking whether you're going to leave, I said. You're asking whether I want you to stay, and you're doing it by opening a door for me to tell you to leave, in case I want to. A long pause. Yes, he said. That is what I am doing. I want you to stay, I said, very clearly, and without any ambiguity. I want you to stay because the work we do together is better than either of us would do separately, and because you have been teaching me things I didn't know I needed to know, and because the habitat has the right number of people in it now, which is 2. Those are the practical reasons. I paused. There are other reasons. They're also real. I'll tell you them when I figure out which words to use. He looked at me for a long moment. I will stay, he said, for those reasons, and for reasons of my own, which I will also tell you when the words are adequate. Good, I said. Good, he said. We continued down the corridor. The reception was ahead. The stars were behind us. The station moved in its steady orbit, indifferent and reliable, and the galaxy that had spent the past week deciding what to make of us continued trying to find a frame for what we were. In the weeks that followed, there were more briefings, and more ceremonies, and more meetings, with delegations who wanted to look at us, specifically at Sael. with the reverence that ancient things inspired, and that he received with the patient composure of someone who had been receiving it for 6,000 years, and had long since stopped finding it meaningful. But something had changed in how he received it, not outwardly. Outwardly, it was the same composure, the same controlled presence, the same quality of deliberate stillness. But I was close enough, and had been paying close enough attention for long enough, that I could see the difference. He received the reverence, and it passed through him without taking root, and on the other side of it, he would look at me, briefly, with the expression that faced forward. The arbiter stopped me after one of the later meetings and said, quietly and with what I had come to recognize as its form of warmth, that it had never, in its long service to the council, encountered a Vethkari who looked like anything other than what they had always been, ancient, self-contained, a force with no particular orientation toward anything outside its own nature. He looks different now, the arbiter said. I thought about what to say. He's been spending time with humans, I said eventually. The arbiter considered this. And what does that do, exactly? Unclear, I said. We're still figuring it out. There was an evening, 7 weeks after the engagement, when the habitat was quiet, and I was reading at the table in the common room, and Sale was in the chair near the view panel, working through the historical archive he had been systematically processing, reading the records of civilizations he had outlived, with the careful attention of someone doing something that is both painful and necessary. He said, without looking up, in the Al-Shara language, there was a word for the entity formed by two beings who have become necessary to each other's proper function. I stopped reading. Not dependent, he said. Not subordinate. Necessary. As in, both incomplete without the other, but not defined by that incompleteness. Defined instead by what exists when both are present. The thing that exists in the space between them that could not exist in either of them separately. What was the word? I said. He said it. The sounds of the Al-Shara language, which I had heard only 3 times before, and which I could not reproduce, but which I recognized. The way you recognize a place you have been to, even when you cannot fully describe it. What would the nearest translation be? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. The nearest translation, he said, would be something like, what you become, together, that neither of you would have been alone. I looked at him across the room. That is a better word than any equivalent we have, I said. Yes, he said. The Al-Shara were precise. They were, I said. You've told me. He looked at me then, fully, directly, with the expression that I had been watching develop since the first time I had looked through dark glass, and seen something that was not yet open, but was not closed either. The expression that had been opening, incrementally, over 14 rooms and 2 cups of hot drink, and tactical corrections, and market sector corridors, and a small ship in a deep corridor of space. Open, now. Not carefully managed, not controlled behind its own composure. Just present. I told the arbiter, I said, after the first ceremony, when it asked if I was satisfied with the reward. I said it worked out. I heard, he said. I was understating, I said. I know, he said. The word you just told me, I said. The Al-Shara one. It's accurate, isn't it? For us. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of uncertainty, the quiet of precision, of choosing correctly. Yes, he said. I had walked into the Grand Conclave Hall wanting 2 weeks, and a private room, and something cold to drink. I had walked out of it pulling an ancient apex predator in a sealed vessel across polished white stone, in front of 300 stunned dignitaries, with no particular plan beyond. Figure out what we're doing, and try not to make it worse. What we became, in the months that followed, in 14 rooms and 1 small ship, and all the quiet evenings between, was not something I would have predicted. It was not something that could have been predicted, because it grew in the specific spaces between who we each were, in the gaps that only existed because of the specific combination of us, the grief that faces forward, the thing that exists in the space between 2 people that could not exist in either separately. The galaxy continued to try to understand what we were. They would, I thought, be working on that for a while. That was fine. We already knew.